Okay, we're moving on to Chapter 9 of my autobiography. This is Chapter 9, Boulder, The Ascent to Hell. When I arrived in Boulder, my ex greeted me with a very warm, loving hug. We had not seen each other for 5 months, and once again we were excited to be together. I was beginning to have hopes that the divorce might not be final. We drove over to the place which she had picked out for me, a very interesting space on the main street of a small town about 10 miles from Boulder called Erie. And this is it right here. This former retail space on the main street of Erie is where I lived in 2009. And this was my apartment right here with the window right there. And I set up shop there, sort of like a writer on display, you might say. Okay, the space I moved into had been a video cassette rental store at one time, and once, long ago, a tiny jazz bar. I liked it very much. It had a small kitchenette in the back, as well as a nearly worthless shower stall, but I thought it was a fun idea to live in a retail space on the main street of a small town. I could sit at my desk in front of the large window and gaze out at the townspeople passing by. I would be a sort of writer on exhibit. We unpacked some furniture there, mostly boxes of books, and then drove over to my son's school. When he came out to the front office, his mother pointed at me and said, "Look, who's that?" At first he stared at me with incomprehension, and then, as recognition settled in, his face lit up with joy, and he ran to greet me. I swooped him up and kissed him. It was one of the best moments of my life. We drove back to my retail studio and spent the rest of the day unpacking my things, setting up bookcases, arranging my bed and my desk in front of the window. Later, as the lavender twilight drew down, we ate dinner and got stoned. My son and I rolled around on the floor, both of us giggling uncontrollably while I tickled him. My ex said, "I haven't seen him like that since Phoenix." Gee, I wonder why. Later, after the kid was asleep, we had sex for the last time. But that was the best day of the increasingly worse and worse days of the 2 years that I spent in Boulder. Everything from that point on went straight downhill. I had begun working as a proofreader for both semiotext and zone books, but the work was sporadic and never amounted to much of an income. I was aware that there was a small publishing industry in Boulder, and I had gone up there hoping to find some sort of an editorial job. But after the '08 crash, no one was hiring. So I wound up getting 2 jobs working at 2 bookstores, one located on the main mall on Pearl Street called Boulder Bookstore, and this is it here, one of the worst places I've ever worked in my life. The people there were awful. One Boulder Bookstore and the other working for the University Campus Bookstore, so I was working 3 jobs, and I had gone back to wrestling with my book about the history of human burial practices, a manuscript which I had been working on by that point off and on for about 5 years, which I later incorporated into my 2024 novel Motorcycle Girl Descends into Hell. So I managed to salvage that manuscript as the father's black notebook in that particular volume. I had begun work on The Age of Catastrophe in Phoenix, but had then set it aside, not sure whether it was any good or not. This was a common pattern for me. I would start a book, write a couple of chapters, and then get discouraged because I would think they weren't any good, then pick up the manuscript months or even years later and resume working on it. I'm still doing that with books. There was a point where I had probably 5 or 6 manuscripts in various stages of completion, which remains true to this day. In Boulder, I was waiting for Prager Greenwood to bring out Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, but when 2010 rolled around and Michael Jackson died, they demanded that I add a chapter on him. I was reluctant to do so because I assumed, along with everyone else, that he was a pedophile, and I didn't want a pedophile to join my little electronic Olympus. But as I began doing the research on him and reading several biographies, I realized that he was most likely not a pedophile, but had been framed by gold digger parents looking for his money. So after I finished writing that last chapter and turned it in, I said to my editor, "I don't care who dies next, the book is finished." And within a few months, they brought out the book in a nice hardcover edition, but it bombed. Nobody wanted to read an intellectual book about celebrities, which I think must have sounded to most literate people like an oxymoron. I thought I was founding a whole new field, celebrity studies. The publisher, however, was bitter about it, and they never talked to me again, although, as of 2025, they are in the process of reverting the rights back to me, and I will republish it in a revised, expanded, and illustrated edition as part of my Iconic Books press. Now you may ask about the K, the letter K, that I've chosen in the way that I spell the name of my press. Why is the K larger than all the other characters there? Couple of things. K is the symbol for potassium, and potassium is what runs your nervous system. It can't operate without it, and it is therefore a mercurial element. The nervous system has to do with knowledge, communication, and so forth. It's Hermes Mercury. So there's that. It's also, when we say 10K, we mean 10,000. So it's also connected with millennia in that sense. And it's the 11th letter of the alphabet. So that means you've completed a denarius at 10, and then with 11, you're starting a new sequence all over again. I think very, very carefully about every single detail I choose in my books. Nothing is random or accidental. So my relationship with my ex was steadily deteriorating. Her family had found a new scapegoat, my ex's sister's husband, but I refused to join in with their game playing, and this put even more stress on our relationship, as my ex was now closer with her family than she was with me. And then there was a gas leak in my retail space apartment, and I had to move out and find a new place very quickly. I found a nice elderly couple who were renting out a basement apartment of their house. There wasn't much sunlight down in that basement, and the landlord warned me that I might get depressed, but I assured him I was mainly a night owl anyway, and that it wouldn't bother me. I was wrong. This house was located in the town of Lafayette, just up the road from Erie, and I liked it much better than Erie, which had the culturally deprived feel to me of some place in Nebraska. Indeed, there is a huge cultural border between Boulder in the west and the rest of eastern Colorado, which is composed mainly of conservative Bible Belt farmers. Erie was pretty much the westernmost border of that cultural divide, and I hadn't liked the town much. There were fights at the bar across the street on weekends, and one night I had to listen to a guy getting stabbed. Boulder was sophisticated and cozy by comparison, but not much to my liking either. Its inhabitants were all rich white people whom I found to be conceited, arrogant, and entitled. I did not like the staff at Boulder Bookstore, and I hit it off with absolutely no one there. That's the first bookstore I ever worked at where that happened. Well, maybe the Barnes & Noble, too. Corporate places just attract nasty, nasty people. My co-workers were mostly snotty, trust fund, spoiled college girls who were completely full of themselves and uninteresting. Within 4 months of taking that job, one night I got so depressed that I simply disappeared out the side door. They never heard from me again. Now that just left me with my job at the campus bookstore, and that was only a temporary summer job. Once that had expired by the end of the summer, the only income I had was from various editing and proofreading gigs. Life was now becoming a grim struggle just to stay alive. I was spiraling down into full-blown alcoholism, drinking nearly every night and then waking up to do my work the next day. I had become a functional alcoholic, in other words, just like my grandfather and great-grandfather had been. My ex was slowly, steadily receding away from me. Whenever I visited her apartment, it was now strictly to take the kid out to the park and go play with him for a couple of hours. I was rarely even invited to dinner with them anymore. I was starting to realize that it was indeed truly over. She no longer wanted me, and she was always irritated to be around me. I had become a nuisance. It's coldly sobering to realize that you don't matter, and very possibly never did. It was at that point that I decided to shave my head bald. It was time to shed a snakeskin. I had threatened during our marriage to shave my head, but my ex never liked the idea. My rocket scientist grandfather had been bald, and I had always liked his look, so I went through with it. When I picked the kid up from school with no hair on my face or head, he said, "Dad, you look funny." And I said to him, "But doesn't it look kind of cool? Bald guys are always tough guys, right?" Then he laughed and said, "Yeah, Dad, you're right, it does look cool." I felt vindicated. If the kid liked it, it must be okay. Now at school, my son's situation was also becoming increasingly more and more disastrous. He didn't have a learning disability because he always understood everything I explained to him about culture, history, or science, which he particularly liked. So we knew the problem wasn't cognitive. We knew he had something, though, but the specialists that my ex took him to see said that he was still too young for a proper diagnosis. But at school, he could not get along with his classmates. Every day in the afternoon, I would get a call from the ex at her job telling me that I needed to pick up our son. I enjoyed spending those afternoons with him, but each call we got from the school was worse than the one before. Your son pushed a classmate backwards over a chair. Your son stabbed a girl with his pencil. And then sometimes he would simply walk out of the classroom and go wandering down the hallways by himself. Finally, we got the diagnosis. He had Asperger's syndrome, a form of high-functioning autism. Neither of us was surprised. We had noticed some strange behaviors. He rarely made eye contact. In restaurants, he would carefully arrange the chairs into straight lines. But he and I never had any problems ever. I loved him very much, and he knew it. We were both very affectionate with each other. I always looked forward to nights when my ex let him stay over at my basement apartment. We would spend the night playing games, building complete cities with his wooden blocks, and watching movies. But the ex was complaining that the movies were giving him nightmares. I shrugged it off because no matter what I did as a father, she didn't like it. She was just jealous, as always. She knew she was a bad parent and couldn't live with the guilt it was causing her. I was starting to go crazy with depression and anxiety. I would walk in circles around the perimeter of my basement apartment, wringing my hands and crying. I was terribly lonely. I had no friends in Colorado, and I had refrained from dating just on the off chance that my ex and I might get back together. But as I was realizing that that was simply never going to happen, I felt myself beginning to drown in heartbreak. The drinking worsened. There were simply no jobs in Boulder. My rent was cheap, and I had few expenses, so for about a year I survived on proofreading gigs and begging and borrowing money from friends. I found a Catholic mission up the street that gave out free food every 2 weeks, and that's what I survived on for an entire year. I had begun work on a new book entitled Rage and the Word, which was solicited by an agent who was a friend of John LaBelle's. The agent was a fan of Rudolf Steiner, and I told him I wanted to write a book about science and religion. I would discuss the two differing worldviews based on the lives of the founders of ancient Western religions as contrasted with the founders of the scientific worldview, namely Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and Albert Einstein. I was going to play them off against Jesus Christ, Mohammed, and the Buddha. The agent thought it was a wonderful idea, but the first chapter that I wrote was a study of the life of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, the original founder of monotheism, and when I sent it to him, he said to me, "I'm not sensing a bestseller here." Neither did I, as I had no idea I was supposed to be writing a trashy, faddish, here today, gone yesterday, Daniel Pinchbeck or Malcolm Gladwell book. I told him to go fuck himself, and stopped work on that book, which I never did finish, although a few years later I published the chapters that I had written on Akhenaten, Moses, and Gilgamesh as a sort of broken torso of a book. And as of 2025, I am republishing it in a completely revised format that's written in a totally different style, doing things with nonfiction that you're not supposed to do. So it's interesting, this book will exist in two different incarnations, one that follows academic rules with proper citation and punctuation and so forth, and the new hardcover, high-res, packed with high-res images that look amazing, but doing all kinds of stylistically wild and crazy things that you're only supposed to really do with either fiction or poetry, not nonfiction. Well, I said, fuck that. This is a book about rage, so I'm going to make fun of academe and just pull it to pieces. Some of that I'm doing here also in this book, as you're noticing the punctuation is gradually disappearing. The next chapter has no punctuation at all because I'm feeling diminished at this point in my life. I had resumed working on The Age of Catastrophe after taking my son to a science exhibition at the Denver Science Museum. They had arranged a series of dioramas of catastrophes, both natural and man-made, that you could walk through with huge maps and gigantic photographs, and the whole thing struck me as a kind of work of contemporary art. I remembered reading about how the French theoretician Paul Virilio had always wanted to found a museum for accidents, and I thought that it would be interesting to treat accidents of both kinds as though they were works of art. I would think of them in aesthetic terms, in other words, and mine them for their hidden semiotics. But one afternoon, I went to the local Tower Records and found the store to be completely vacated. The sign in the window said that Tower Records was now out of business. I was stunned. Tower Records? Out of business? I had grown up with Tower Records as one of my favorite stores, and now they were just gone? I went home and began searching the internet and started realizing that magazines and newspapers were also shutting down and going out of business. Premier Magazine, gone. Gourmet Magazine, gone. The Partisan Review, Playgirl, nearly all the literary quarterlies, gone. It hit me like a thunderbolt. Over the past 15 years, the internet had been simply decimating the culture of analog media that I had grown up in, and I hadn't even noticed what was happening. I did notice a little bit when I was living in San Francisco. A lot of the bookstores had to close because of online book sales of rare books and so forth. I realized that we were witnessing a media extinction event. The internet had crashed into our mediatic horizon like an asteroid and simply destroyed the Gutenbergian galaxy almost overnight. Although I didn't realize it at the time, what was actually happening was a shift from postmodernity to the advent of a whole new cultural epoch called hypermodernity. Just as geological epochs are punctuated with catastrophes, so too are cultural epochs. I began to wonder if Marshall McLuhan were alive, what he would have said about the internet. What witty aphorisms would he have come up with regarding Facebook and Google, Amazon and Wikipedia? I knew McLuhan's books very, very well, so I decided to sit down and see what I could make of all this. So I sat at my desk in that basement apartment, with my life in ruins all around me, and wrote an essay about Facebook, then one about Google, then YouTube, and the book just flowed right out of me, and I finished it within a few months and realized that I had a good manuscript on my hands. I found an obscure academic publisher named McFarland Books, located in Jefferson, North Carolina, to take it on. They didn't like the title I had for it, The Great Media Extinction, so I offered them The New Media Invasion as an alternative, which they loved, and which I suppose is the better title, actually. So then I resumed work on The Age of Catastrophe. All of these books, Gods and Heroes of the Media Age, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, Rage in the Word, The New Media Invasion, and Gilgamesh Redux, were written virtually simultaneously. I knew that I had finally found my stride as a writer and that a creative explosion was taking place. This is what you get in astrology with Uranus opposite Uranus, which happens right about age 40, and Uranus is the planet of breakthroughs. Saturn, meanwhile, was sitting on my ascendant, and when it does that, it cuts people out of your life. I knew that I had finally found my stride. Let's see, when I would visit my ex, we would lounge around the pool of her apartment complex. As I excitedly explained to her all these books and these new ideas I was having, she seemed totally bewildered. She was not getting it at all. It all grew wings and flew over her air-brained head, and it was frustrating because somewhere in the back of my mind I wanted to impress her into realizing that she had made a mistake leaving me, that my career as a writer was finally taking off, and that she should have stuck with me. But she was too stupid by this point to understand anything about what I was doing. I had to let her go. She was becoming a shade in the Hades of my past. There was nothing left of the woman I had fallen in love with 15 years ago. That person I had so admired and respected for her sense of humor and rebelliousness had given way to becoming a mere clone of one of her sisters' lives. Sisters whom she had used to despise for their bourgeois conventionality and boring materialism. She was one of them now. A shallow, empty materialist who had come into being simply to perpetuate the species and die. She had failed me, not the other way around. I had stayed true to my values and followed them with unerring instincts. Meanwhile, I was running out of money and running out of options. I called my mother and explained the situation to her. She advised getting a job at a supermarket or something, but I told her that I would rather commit suicide and that I would, if necessary, rather than betray my dreams. One night I called her up and told her that I was going to hang myself. But she talked me through it, and I decided to keep going with the project, come what may. But something spooky then happened that convinced me it was time to leave Boulder. A neighbor had recently moved into the basement apartment that was right next door to mine. He was a man who had also recently divorced and was about the same age as I, mid-40s. He was bipolar, as the landlord later explained, and alcoholic. I talked with him a few times while he stood outside smoking, but only in pleasantries. He seemed like a nice, likable guy. But one day I noticed that he had left his door open, which I had seen him do before to allow fresh air into the basement. Something bothered me about it this time, though. I could hear the television on inside, and there was a cardboard box on the floor near the open doorway containing some mail in it. I noticed this as I went to the liquor store to buy some beer and went home that night. The next morning as I passed the door, everything was exactly the same. Door half open, TV on, mail on the floor. It definitely did not feel right, so I poked my head in and said his name and asked if he was okay. "Rob, you all right?" sort of thing. From the back bedroom, I distinctly heard his voice mumble something that sounded like he was half asleep, like, "Oh, I'm fine. I just figured he must be sleeping one off. But the next day, exactly the same situation, and when I said his name this time, there was no answer. I immediately informed the landlord, and they called the paramedics. Through my closed door, I could hear them saying, "We've got rigor here," and I realized that my neighbor must have died sometime in the middle of the night. I never found out for sure, but it sounded like an overdose of some sort had taken place. Somehow, though, I felt responsible. If I had just informed the landlord one day earlier, he might have survived. Then one night, a couple of weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling cold, which was odd because though it was the middle of the winter, I was sleeping on an air mattress surrounded by no less than 3 space heaters. It shouldn't be cold. Not at all. But it was. I examined the space heaters to see if one of them wasn't working or had shut off, but all 3 of them were working just fine. I climbed up off the air mattress and realized that there was a pool of cold air surrounding my air mattress, but nowhere else. The temperature was normal everywhere else. For some strange reason, the top of my now bald head was ice cold. I went to the bathroom to examine it and couldn't figure out why the crown of my head was so cold. I then started to suspect a supernatural visitation from my dead neighbor, and that creeped me the hell out. I waited for the cold air to go away, thinking of Lovecraft's short story with the same title, and when it did, I was able to get back to sleep. But I knew that it was time to leave Boulder. I made arrangements to go back to my mother's house. Her third husband had died a couple of years before, and now she was living alone, and her health was deteriorating. She had diabetes and was severely obese and barely able to walk up and down the long hallways at her job at the hospital, where she worked as a substance abuse counselor. I didn't know how long I would be living there, but I needed a place to stay while I sorted my career out and figured out how to make a decent living. It was a terrible, terrible feeling, realizing that I was going to have to say goodbye to my son again. A couple of days before I left, I took him out to a park and had a long conversation with him, explaining how I had to leave Boulder to go and live with my mother for a while. But I explained that he would be flying out to see me every now and then, and that we could spend the summers doing fun things together. He was very genial and matter-of-fact about it, but I don't think he quite realized yet the emotional implications of what was happening. On the last day, I went to see him to say goodbye at his school classroom. At that point, he burst into tears and started crying and wouldn't stop. It was one of the worst moments of my entire life. I had disappointed him. I had failed him yet again as a father. I kissed him, hugged him, and then in tears turned and walked out of the classroom. It was going to be a long, long drive down to Phoenix. And that will be the next chapter. Here we are. I think all of us there are in, looks like 2009, right about this time at my mother's house. And so that'll be, I'm working on the next chapter here, Losing My Son, 10. It's a denarius. It completes a cycle when you arrive at 10. You know, a cycle is ending numerologically speaking. Okay, so we'll leave it there.